It's a beautiful January day here in Southern Oregon, and it's in the mid-50s outside in the sun. We're known as what's called the banana belt of Oregon because we get these clear, sunny days in the winter, where up north from us oftentimes is still cloudy and foggy or quite rainy. So today, what I'm hoping to share with you is the broad idea of agrobiodiversity. Agrobiodiversity. It's a word that hopefully we'll become more familiar with, and it's highly likely that many of you have never even heard this word. We've heard of biodiversity. However, having a diverse group of plants that support our food and fiber for clothing and medicine is literally at the foundation of human civilization. If we didn't have this, we would just go away, or our population numbers would drastically decrease. So this is a broad concept. I'm going to do my best to condense it down into 15 or 20 minutes, and this dovetails into many other topics that we've talked about, whether it's adaptation or Nikolai Vavilov or evolution. And if you haven't watched those episodes yet, they might be good prerequisites or precursors to this talk today. So the concept of agrobiodiversity is basically, we've all heard this saying, eat the rainbow, which refers to eating a diet that's rich in colors or polyphenols or plant phytonutrients that come from the sun, whether that's eating purple potatoes or red carrots or blueberries or white onions, so that because each basically plant pigment is drawing from a different kind of facet of the spectrum of vitamins and minerals that come from sunlight and sugars and water. That's a gross oversimplification of how we tap into the minerals, nutrients, carbohydrates, and calories that human beings need to live healthy, productive lives. Currently on planet Earth, we keep discovering new plant species, but as far as current science, we understand there to be about 585,000 plant species total. That includes all the native plants from the deserts to the rainforest. According to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, which is known by the acronym UNFAO, that's currently headquartered in Rome, Italy, there's about 7,000 plants that are eaten by humans right now around the planet. However, only about 200 of them are common. So if you were to walk into a grocery store somewhere near you, you would encounter about 200 plants, and those would range from wheat to rice to apples to blueberries to carrots to echinacea, fenugreek, sage, to cotton. Those are mostly what support human civilization. However, only 30 species, so if we consider this about 600,000, this represents about, 0.05%, 30 species, give us 95% of the calories that we consume on the planet right now. That is staggering. And here's another fact that's if it's not going to blow you away, then maybe you need to consider this kind of thing a little bit more. And perhaps you've been paying attention to the wrong things because maybe you've never been hungry. And if you were hungry, you might or had been hungry. Consider this a little more deeply. 4 species contribute 60% of the global calories eaten. 3 species contribute 70% of the global calories eaten. Those 3 are wheat, corn, and rice. And my good buddy and mentor, Bill McDorman, who started a seed company in the Montana-Idaho area called High Altitude Gardens, then he later worked for Native Seed Search down in the Sonoran Desert region of Arizona, Mexico. And then later, I had the pleasure of working with him with the Rocky Mountain Seed Alliance. He, through his analysis and pondering of all this, realize there are rice people, wheat people, and corn people. So you can think the rice people are the great civilizations of Asia. The wheat people are the great civilizations of the Fertile Crescent, Mesoamerica. I'm sorry, not Mesoamerica, that's the corn people. So the Fertile Crescent and the Mediterranean, because eventually wheat, barley, all those other ones were what fed the great civilizations of that area. And lastly is the corn people of Mesoamerica. So corn was a tropical grass that was domesticated by indigenous farmers in the highlands near present-day Oaxaca, Mexico, and later spread both south into South America and north into North America. Those carbohydrates are what enabled civilization to thrive because they allowed people to have a store of grain. When it was hunter-gatherers, everybody had to have a role in going and finding food on a regular basis because food stores were not as common. But once you could store grain, then it allowed society to specialize into bankers, astrologers, healers, prophets, you name it, all out there. And grain could be taxed, which led to economies, governments, monarchies, all of this. That's a huge topic. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole right now. However, it is worth considering for people how foundational the cereal grains are to the wealth of nations, military power, and why the world is the way it is, and why we're fighting wars in Ukraine, because that's the breadbasket of that region of the world. So, diving into the idea of agrobiodiversity, I think we need to consider that there's three main facets. There's organismal biodiversity, which is the total number of species. So I mentioned there were 585,000 species of plants that are growing on planet Earth, more or less. There's about 200 common species that are eaten, but of those species, tomatoes would be one, and within tomatoes, we eat many varieties. So the second type of biodiversity would be landscape biodiversity. So that's different types of habitats. So here I'm at a foothills of the mountains kind of habitat. My colleague, Dr. Robert Bugg, initiated this project called the Mountain Agrobiodiversity Project, looking at those intermountain areas, much like where we are now, or the foothills out of the Andes, or in Mesoamerica near Oaxaca, or the mid-altitudinal zones in Turkey, Italy, all over the world. Ethiopia, there seems to be this pattern that those areas were never heavily industrialized, so they contain a higher percentage of global agrobiodiversity than the flatlands where most of the fertile soil was, where it was easier to do mechanized agriculture, and as a result tended to move towards more monocrop agriculture. So the third type of biodiversity that we're going to entertain primarily in this discussion today is that of genetic biodiversity. So that's varietal. As I mentioned, with tomatoes, there's probably 1,000 varieties of tomatoes, if not more. Potatoes, there's an estimated 600 varieties of potatoes in the Andean region that indigenous farmers domesticated there. Dahlias would blow your mind. There's 57,000 named cultivars of dahlias, and similarly with roses, tulips, and other crops. Dry beans would be another one that's highly speciated. So total varietal diversity might be upwards of 1 million varieties around the planet. And we may never know, because as things move through trade, the same actual variety might be given a different name as it moves from one region to another. So Jacob's cattle bean and Anasazi, in my estimation, look like the same thing. However, people give them different names in different dialects, all that kind of thing. This diversity is good, and the confusion is good. We should be blurring the lines. There should be infinite agrobiodiversity out there. And this brings me to the point of Nikolai Vavilov that I've covered in a different podcast episode that you should definitely go check out. It should be a name that should be at the tip of your tongue, much like a Charles Darwin or a Rachel Carson or a Jane Goodall or any of these characters, John Muir, Gregor Mendel, these names that are really those that gave us a deeper insight into what's going on. Anyhow, Nikolai Vavilov was born in he was actually born in the late 1800s, but between the years 1916 and 1926, he explored every continent on the planet except for Antarctica, which really has no plants, looking for greater agrobiodiversity, because he was primarily concerned with starvation, and particularly averting it by having greater diversity of foods to support human thriving. Throughout these expeditions, that you got to consider that time period, these were happening with donkey mule trains, oftentimes in challenging landscapes, no cell phones, no modern conveniences to facilitate this, language barriers, that kind of thing, infectious diseases. They gathered 150,000 different varietal specimens, of which there were 3,000 different varieties of wheat, because wheat is so foundational to civilization in the northern latitudes, when you consider that both rice and corn are subtropical grasses, whereas wheat is a cold hardy grain, along with barley, oats, rye. They can deal with colder temperatures, where rice and corn, a light frost would kill them, along with millet, that's the fifth most commonly grown species on the planet. So through that work, he identified this watershed moment in human civilization that he called the centers of origin in 1927, and published a book on this concept. I fleshed this out better in different talks, but I just want to revisit it, that there were 8 primary centers of origin, and those include Mesoamerica, in what's present-day Mexico, the Andes, so Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, that part of the world, the Mediterranean, primarily the North Mediterranean, but also North Africa there, basically all the countries that skirt the Mediterranean. Then India, which is, carrots are from India, along with a whole host of other things, eggplants. Then China, which gave us a great many things like onions, garlic, Chinese cabbage, I could go on. Ethiopia, and which is where coffee, one of the varieties of wheat, also the Iraq-Syria area, which is another area of what we call the Fertile Crescent. Southeast Asia had a whole host of other crops. Then Turkey is another kind of extension from that Mediterranean area. Then lastly would be Brazil, which is things like peanuts and pineapple. We could get more granular about this, but what's interesting is when we consider the United States as basically the agricultural superpower of the world, because we have been able to mobilize a lot of fossil fuels and military might, gave none of the varieties, none of the main crops that we consume today, except for sunflowers, are native to what is the current political boundaries of the United States. I find this fascinating. So to close this chapter on Vavilov, is that sadly, Stalin, really with Lysenko whispering in his ear, identified Vavilov as intellectually elite, and he died in 1943 of starvation in a gulag prison. And interestingly enough, the siege of Leningrad in 1945 that led to over 1 million people dying. The Vavilov Institute had the largest seed bank on the planet at that time, and all the workers of the Vavilov Institute barricaded themselves inside the building. It's surrounded by sacks of lentils, chickpeas, wheat, oats, potatoes, all this kind of stuff they could have eaten. But they knew the importance of all this agrobiodiversity, the future of humanity, and they all chose to die of starvation. And incredibly tragic for them, but also a great blessing for those of us today, because that seed diversity is generating benefit today. And as we know, Hitler and the Nazi Socialist Party lost the siege of Leningrad, and history would be different if they had not. But even Hitler knew that conquering that seed bank was key to conquering the world. You got human genetics and plant genetics are two sides. So if you think about this today, what's fascinating is the primary seed bank here in the United States is in Fort Collins, Colorado, right next to where most of the nuclear silos are. So they chose to situate the germplasm repository as far as possible from each coast so that nuclear missiles couldn't hit it. And we have hundreds of thousands of varieties in liquid nitrogen cold storage there today. So agrobiodiversity is one of the primary geopolitical items of importance. And the powers that be know this. However, I just finished reading this great book by this guy, Mark Bittman, called Animal Vegetable Junk. And it's just a quick, knockdown, quick and dirty history of agriculture. And it shows how we move from peasant farmers and agriculture being something that almost everybody was involved in, just one degree or another. There were no supermarkets, there was no global trade. There might have been a little bit of like trade in spices and silk and cotton and this kind of thing, but most food was grown and consumed highly local. Then we had the rapid industrialization of World War I, World War II, and we applied the war on human beings to a war on agriculture to make it more efficient, more productive. So we saw tanks become tractors, we saw poison nerve gas become insecticides, we saw bomb-making facilities become the fertilizer industry, and we went from an entirely open-pollinated seed supply where almost all farmers grew and saved much of their own seed, and there were no seed companies until the late 1800s when William Atlee Burpee of Burpee's Seeds fame started the first seed company in the world. And before that, seed was an intrinsic element of agriculture. So all of that industrialization led to this push of farmers off the land and into factories for a rapidly industrializing world, and this resulted in much fewer food choices, industrialization of agriculture with machines, so one farmer could farm much more land, but that also meant that they grew a fewer diversity of crops because wheat became king. And then in sometime around World War II is when hybrid corn really took precedence, and this idea of commodity crops that just kind of rolls off the tongue nowadays took primacy. And then this overproduction, incentivized through Green New Deal and post-Dust Bowl era incentives from FDR and stuff, because basically in the words of, I believe it was Leopold, that talked about wheating the land to death. And this occurred in the 30s, when the drive to industrialize between World War I and World War II led to over-farming of the deep prairie lands. And it didn't catch the attention of the elites until dust storms made it so the streetlights had to be turned on at noon in Chicago and New York. And the presidents and other captains of industry, their desks were covered in a layer of silt. And this is where the soil conservation strategy that we now call the Natural Resources Conservation Strategy, NRCS, it's a branch of the USDA, and other motivational programs like this started to take care of our soil. Nonetheless, this overproduction led to surplus and grain exports. And right now the U.S. is generally, most years, the top grain exporter. Ukraine used to be one, Russia, Australia, those are the primary ones, France too. And if you are the ones producing the food for people, primarily wheat, but also corn and soy, then you can manipulate policy around the world, because hungry people will do your bidding. This overproduction and surplus led to the birth of processed foods and the chemical industry turning its attention to food. So we saw junk food, we saw CAFOs, which is confined animal feedlot operation, factory farms, this kind of thing. Chicken was not commonly eaten 100 years ago. It wasn't until we saw the surplus of grain and they tried to figure out, well, what do we feed it? So the feed makers, which were part of this overproduction surplus mindset, needed a market. So the idea of like, well, chickens eat grain, and they're a fairly efficient converter of grain into protein. So all of a sudden, Betty Crocker and Joy of Cooking and home economics, home ec, remember, if you're my age or older, everybody had to take that in school. The idea that you buy bread and the milkman delivers milk instead of you have a cow and you're baking your own bread. All these became normalized in this post-World War II industrialization and just a complete abandonment of our agrarian roots. To the point nowadays, it's less than 1% of people are involved in agriculture directly. So the idea of agrobiodiversity, that we need more different species and varieties of plants and animals feeding us, was a foreign concept to most people, and I believe still is today. And one of my friends and colleagues, Richo Czech, who has a medicinal herb seed company called Strictly Medicinal nearby, he pointed out when we saw GMO crops beginning to make inroads into agricultural areas, he said, well, maybe we're going to need to abandon some of those traditional foods like corn. That, you know, a lot of what is produced industrially is hybrid GMO corn grown with tons of chemicals, and embrace new foods. So think of all the people that eat sweet potatoes, or the rise of gluten-free and all the grains like quinoa and millet and tapioca that make their way into those foods, or things like quinoa or cacao or coconut that 30 years ago, I know in my life, you rarely saw these things. And now we're seeing a great blossoming of food producers interested in agrobiodiversity as people realize the overly industrialized for production and yield and uniformity, they've denatured the nutritional value of a lot of these things. So people are returning to these more ancestral diets. And I find that a fascinating thing. So nutrition and agrobiodiversity also have a conjoined relationship. So we want to eat from as wide of a spectrum of the biota of plant and animal species as possible, because each one is accessing a different pie wedge, if you will, of nutrients, minerals, amino acids, this kind of thing. Also, things produce at different times of the year. So here on my farm, I think about this. Like, I'm in Oregon. The earliest fruit we have outside, producing outside, is honeyberries, which is commonly eaten in certain parts of Russia and Japan. Most people have never even heard of this. It's in the honeysuckle family, and it produces kind of an elongated blueberry in early May when there's nothing else happening. Then we'll have strawberries and raspberries and more common things. And then if we look late in the season, we'll have things like persimmons that we're harvesting around Thanksgiving time, and we're eating that fruit into December. Or we'll have Russian species of pomegranates that likewise we're eating between Thanksgiving and New Year's. Things like medlars. And then, of course, our stored fruits, like what are the good storage quality apples? Whereas in the supermarket, they don't care, because those Fujis that you buy are stored in carbon dioxide storage, which is obviously uses large amounts of energy and transport to get it to you. So what does our local, bioregional, diverse food supply look like? And sadly, for all the incredible progress for humanity, we keep on narrowing down to those 30 species of plants that produce 95% of the calories. So this idea of agrobiodiversity is really central to my interest and intrigue in having a seed company. And one of the projects I'm excited about launching, and stay tuned for an official release, is this idea of having bioregional seed banks. We have a seed company now, but we have to make that work as a business within the capitalist model. And currently, I live in Oregon. The Oregon Department of Agriculture and our land-grant college, Oregon State University, do not maintain a seed bank for our region. Zero, zilch. They've completely left their post, and they're in a deep dereliction of duty, especially when we consider natural disasters like the fires that are happening in LA, or the hurricane and rains and flooding that happened in the Asheville, North Carolina and surrounding areas, or you look at the Fukushima nuclear disaster and tsunami, or we look at the wars in Afghanistan when their national seed bank was raided by people who were starving, looking for food like wheat and garbanzo beans and lentils and stuff. So I want to start what I'm calling the Cascadia Seed Bank. And it's a fireproof seed bank built into a mountainside here out of concrete and stone, climate controlled, and using the natural cool temperatures of the earth to create a kind of a doomsday vault, but also have it be connected to farms and people actually producing the seeds and determining what varieties are best for our area. And the universities and our agriculture departments run by the government that are all controlled by big ag and the petro-industrial agribusiness model, they're not doing this work. If you think they are, you're deluding yourself, and they are complete lackeys and they're in service to big business. So I think it's better if we crowdsource this and bootstrap our own bioregional communities to have self-determination around regional resilience, to develop regenerative agriculture and seed systems that embrace what grows well, what people want to eat, and what are the emergent culinary and nutritional interests of a region. So check it out. I'll be sharing more information about that. But foundational to it all is this idea of agrobiodiversity. And I truly hope that in my lifetime, I see this begin to be taught in schools. People like Nikolai Vavilov and Darwin and others that were curious about what is this relationship between light from the sun, our star, plants that are photosynthesizing and doing that magic and doing an electron exchange. Check out the photosynthesis episode I did. Animals that are eating these plants, and people, of which we're just an animal. We're eating plants, and we're eating the animals that eat plants to create abundance. And agrobiodiversity wealth is real wealth, and all financial wealth, whether it's crypto, fiat currency, gold, silver, all stems from that. And water, minerals, and your watershed, the health of a functioning watershed, all play a super important part in this. And if you haven't quite gotten up to speed there, I want to encourage you to do so, because it's awesome, because that's what supports your life. That's what supports you being a healthy, productive member of society with visions that propel your life forward and encourage your friends and family and community to do likewise. And that's what the agrarian renaissance is having a new vision rooted in the compost of the old vision of how we used to live, to guide us out of this industrial techno-optimist nightmare that the tech bros and their lackeys are force-feeding us, and tell a new story. So, all right, peace, all the best to you, blessings on you and your family, and your health, and your happiness, and your well-being.